All right, everyone, say good morning. Today's daf is daf Yud. A lot to do today. We left off on daf Tes Amud Beis. V'ha'ika. 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 11 lines up from the bottom. I have a lot of work to do today. So v'ha'ika l'shma. So also remember again, the Mishnah was discussing the ways in which Gittin and Shechruri Avadim are similar. Right? Gittin, divorce documents. Shechruri Avadim, documents of emancipation. How are they similar? So remember again, the Brisa quoted 3 ways. Rabbi Meir had a 4th way, and the Gemara is trying to understand, are there not additional ways in which they are in fact similar? So the Gemara says, Rabbi say, what about the fact that both Gittin and Shechruri Avadim have to be lishma, have to be written for the sake of a particular woman or the sake of a particular eved? So the Gemara says, Bishlam al Rabba, Haynu Molech Umevi. So both according to Rabba, okay, lishma is included because remember in the original list of comparisons, so one of them was Molech Umevi. Molech Umevi according to Rabba means lishma. However, Ela Rava Kashya, but according to Rava, ultimately, why doesn't the Brisa list Lishma, Visu, Bein L'Rabba, Bein L'Rabba, Ha'ika Mechuber? Rabbi say, furthermore, according to Rava and to Rava, there's another comparison, which is what? Mechuber. Rabbi say, Mechuber means what? That Alocha L'Maisa, you cannot write, we actually spoke about this a few days ago, you can't write a get on something that's Mechuber L'Karka. So for example, again, if I want to write a get on a tree, man wants to write a get on the tree, so that does not work. That does not work. Even if you write it, sign it, and subsequently detach it, that get would not be kosher because the get itself must be written on something that is talush. That is not just halacha by Gittin Noshim, it's also halacha by Shechruri Avadim. So this is another comparison. So the Gemara says, Ki katani psul d'Rabbanan, daraisa lo katani. To which the Gemara says, you're right, when we're speaking about the comparisons between Gittin Noshim and Shechruri Avadim, we're only speaking about comparisons that they share with things that are rabbinically invalid. But we are not going ahead and speaking about things that are biblically invalid. To which the Gemara says, is that true? V'ha'arkos shall ovdei kochavim depsula doraisuhu vikatoni. But I will say one of the comparisons that we made is that although normally a shtar that is made in our kos in Gentile courts is not a valid shtar, but Gittin, even though normally shtaros that are made in a Gentile court are valid shtaros, Gittin Noshim and Shechruri Avadim, if they are done in a Gentile court, are not kosher documents. Now, both say, now that invalidation is a biblical invalidation. In fact, Rashi points out over here, it's in the middle of the Rashi of Psula D'Rabbanan. Rashi says, actually right across from Tosos Milsa, Tosos says, Vaha arkos Psula D'Oraisa, she'ein edusam kosher, lefi she'inon b'toras gin v'kiddushin, v'rachmana amar v'kasav v'nasan, Mish yeshno bichlal nesina, yeshno bichlal ksiva. So we'll say the Gemara makes a drasha, which we'll see later on. V'kasav and nasan, only those who have the ability to write the get are in the parsha, or should say only those who have the ability to give a get, in other words, are subject to the laws of Gittin, have the power to write a get. Therefore, our kos, Gentile courts, which have nothing to do with the halachos of Gittin, cannot write a get. So I will say the source of that invalidation is a biblical invalidation, and yet that is included in the list, to which the Gemara says, Be'edei Mesira, Ucharebi Elazar da'amar Eidei Mesira Karsi. No, because the Mishnah reflects whose view? The Mishnah reflects the view ultimately again of Rabbi Elazar, who says Eidei Mesira Karsi. And I both say, we touched on this machlokes a little bit already. We'll touch on it much more in the coming dapim, which is a fundamental machlokes as to Eidei Mesira Karsi or Eidei Chasima Karsi. Which eidos actually validates the get? Is it the eidim who sign on the get? That's Eidei Chasima Karsi, or is it Eidei Mesira? Good morning, Mr. Schoenfeld. Or is it the Eidei Mesira, the witnesses who witness the giving over of the get? Which of those actively go ahead and validate the get there? So we'll take a look at Rashi just a moment. Rabbi Elazar Yidamar Eidei Mesira Karsi. Ve'in sarach lichtom beget. V'chikasav kra v'kasav aksivas haget ksiv v'lo achasimra sedei edim. So both say the Gemara wants to now suggest something very interesting, that the case of our kos is fascinating. The case of our kos, the case of a get written in a Gentile court that will be kosher, is a case of where the get was written by a Jewish scribe, because according to Rabbi Elazar, if you hold Eidei Mesira Karsi, the get itself must be written Lishma. So therefore, again, the get was written by a Jewish scribe, but it was signed by Gentile witnesses in a Gentile court. So we'll say, if you hold Eidei Mesira Karsi, then technically speaking, that get is technically kosher. Because as long as the primary writing was done by a Jewish scribe Lishma, the signatures of the witness, you don't really need signatures of witnesses on the document itself. You just need Jewish witnesses to witness the giving over of the get. So listen to this. So therefore, the Gemara suggesting is the following. When the Brisa says that a get, let's say Gittin and Shichrei Avadim, written in Gentile courts are puzzle, what type of psul is that? That's not a psul d'oraisa, but it's a psul d'rabbanan. How is it a psul d'rabbanan? Because if you hold Eidei Mesira Karsi, if you hold that it's the witnesses who witness the giving over of the get who affect the validity of the get, then in reality, as long as the scribe was Jewish, we don't really care who does or who doesn't sign on the get, because you don't really even need signatures on the get. So in this case, you happen to have Gentile signatures. The halacha is that get will be pasul midrabanan. Why is it pasul midrabanan? Because the rabbis were concerned that if there are Gentile signatures, if there are Gentile witnesses who sign on the get, one may come to rely on those witnesses at some point in time, and therefore the rabbis ruled such a get to be rabbinically invalid, but biblically it's technically kosher. So the Gemara says, so therefore I will say, remember, so therefore the Gemara is proving its assertion that the only comparisons we're making between Gittin and Shichrei Avadim in this case are cases ultimately that are pasul midrabanan. I v'hamidik tani seifa Rabbi Shimon Omer af elu ksherin. We saw in the seifa, I should say, we will see in the seifa on Yom days that Rabbi Shimon says, even Gittin Nashim and Shichrei Avadim written in our codes, written in Gentile courts, are in fact going to be kosher. And the way we explain Rabbi Shimon Shita is that Rabbi Shimon holds like Rabbi Lazar, who says Eidei Mesira Karsi. Mechlal the Tanakama Savarlo. That will say we can infer from that what? That the Tanakama, who is the Tan of our Mishnah, does not hold that way. In which case again, I will say, when the Mishnah says that a Gittin Nashim or Shichrei Avadim that are done in our kos, that's talking about something that is pasul mid'oraisa. If it's pasul mid'oraisa, then it blows a hole in what we just said before. We said before that we're only discussing again situations that are pasul mid'rabanan, but the psul of our kos over here seems to be a psul d'oraisa. Top of Yud, Ika Beinaihu, the practical difference between them will be Shemos Muvhakim. So, to which the Gemara answers, both the Tanakama, the Tana of our Mishnah here, and Rabbi Shimon on Yud Amud Beis, both subscribe to the Shita of Rabbi Elazar, namely Eidei Mesira Karsi. Eidei Mesira Karsi. And the issue at play over here is what happens. So, if you hold Eidei Mesira Karsi, let's play this through. Eidei Mesira Karsi means it's the witnesses who witness the giving over of the get to the woman who ultimately affect the validity of the get. Okay, so if that's the case, then I don't really even need witnesses to sign on the get at all, but they do, and therefore, technically speaking, Gentile witnesses who sign on the get do not impact the validity of the get. However, rabbinically we will say that what? Rabbinically we'll say that the get is invalid because we're concerned that people may come to rely on the Gentile signatures in order to validate the get. Fine. This is what the Gemara says. Let's say you have a case of Shemos Muvhakim. So we'll say, we'll see this in actually tomorrow's daf. What's Shemos Muvhakim? Shemos Muvhakim are names that are clearly Gentile in nature. Right? So, I don't know, today it's hard to, Chris. I'm assuming, right? There aren't too many Jewish Chris's, right? So you go ahead. Is that correct? Pashtos. So we'll say, listen to this case. Let's say you have signatures on the get that are clearly not Jewish. So what's the status of the get midrabanan? Take a look at Rashi just a moment. Tap Rashi and Yud Amud Aleph. Ika benayu shemos mufhakim. Kilomar tanakama b'shitas Rabbi Elazar kai umidrabanu depasi dilma asel mismach achasu lemosr b'fneihem va'asir Rabbi Shimon lemeimar im shemos mufhakim da'ovdei kochavim heim she'ein yisrael nikrain ba'osan shemos lav hainu mizuyaf mitocho Demod Rebbe Lazar ducholi almu yadi de'ovdei kochavim heim v'lo asi lemismach halayab lo edim yisrael. So listen to this. So says the Gemara, the nafkamina will be our Tana in our Mishnah holds that even if the names are clearly Gentile, and therefore no one's ever going to come to rely on them to validate the get is still possible midrabanan. Rabbi Shimon, on the other hand, who we'll see Mir Hashem a little bit later today, holds that if the names are clearly Gentile, therefore again there is no fear that anyone is ever going to rely on these names to validate the get, and therefore the get will be kosher even midrabanan. So the Gemara says, "I have a chazara d'oraisa v'katani," but I will say one of the comparisons that we had between Gittin Noshim and Shechrui Avadim is that technically speaking, again, a husband could retract both of them, and yet again, if the husband retracts the get or the get Shechrur, ultimately again that invalidates the get midoraisa, and yet it's still quoted in the list. Elaki katani milsa delesa b'kiddushin, milsa deisa b'kiddushin lo katani. To which the Gemara says, "You're right. The only things Rabbi say that the only comparisons that we're making between Gittin Noshim and Shechrui Avadim are situations or are factors that are, I should say, are cases that do not apply to kiddushin. Cases that apply to Kiddushin as well, we do not go ahead and list as comparisons between Gittin Noshim and Shechrui Avadim. We'll say, take a quick look at Rashi. Rashi says, "Ela ki katani milsa d'lesa b'kiddushin kelomar ki parchanim la'el ha'ika b'mechubar u'lishma lo mishani lo tishani psula d'oraisa lo katani ela ema milsa de'isa b'kiddushin lo katani kegon lishma u'mechubar isa nami b'shtari kiddushin." So also what the Gemara essentially says over here now is, well, see, here's what's bothering the Gemara. The Gemara makes it sound like there are only three comparisons between Gittin Noshim and Shechrui Avadim. All the Gemara is pointing out is it's not true. It's clear that there are more than three areas, there are more than three common denominators between Shechrui Avadim and Gittin Noshim. To which the Gemara says, you're right, but we're only speaking about comparisons that fit into a certain framework. So at first we thought only a framework of the Rabbana, not the Oraisa. So that doesn't work. Now the Gemara is suggesting is we're only speaking about comparisons that are unique to these two that don't apply to, let's say, Kiddushin. So we'll say, for example, the first mission in Kiddushin says that there are three ways in which a man could be Mekadesh a woman, right? Kesef, Shtar, and Bia. So let's say a man is Mekadesh a woman with Shtar, with a document. So we'll say that document, interestingly enough, the Gemara is suggesting, has to be Lishma, has to be for the sake of this particular woman, and also cannot be written on something that is mechuber lekarka. So therefore, the Gemara says when we're looking for comparisons between Gittin Noshim and Shechrui Avadim, we're looking for comparisons that are unique to these two and not shared by other types of documents like Shtari Kiddushin. That's why, again, we're not including Lishma. That's why we're not including Mechuber. To which the Gemara says, "I v'ha chazara gufa isa b'kiddushin." But one second. But I will say, what about the fact that the husband has the ability, or the master has the ability, to retract Gittin Noshim and Shechrui Avadim after he dispatches it with a shliach? That also applies to Kiddushin, right? If a man dispatches a shtar for Kiddushin with his shaliach and then cancels the shlichus, he has the ability to invalidate the Kiddushin like that. To which the Gemara says, "B'shlichus ba'al karcha to be gerishin isa or b'kiddushin lessa." So both say the fundamental distinction is that in gerishin, both Gittin Noshim and Shechrui Avadim, so we will see these processes can take place against the will of the individuals. A man could divorce his wife against her will. A master could free his servant against his will. A man cannot be mekadesh a woman ultimately against her will. So we'll say, so bottom line, halacha l'maisa, what comes out from this sugya is there are a number of different comparisons between Gittin Noshim and Shechrui Avadim. According to the Tanakama, there were three. According to Rabbi Meir, ultimately there were four. And even though technically speaking, there are more than three, or there are even more than four, the Gemara is only choosing to list certain circumstances or certain comparisons between Gittin Noshim and Shechrui Avadim that are unique by those two and don't apply in other cases. I will say, just also keep in mind, the underlying machlokis over here between Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Lazar, just about Ede Mesira Karsi or Ede Chasima Karsi. Again, we have not even seen that. It's actually, we're going to begin to see it on Amud Beis today, but that's going to be one of our major machlokisim in terms of what type of testimony actually creates the validity of the get. We reflexively assume that it's the witnesses who sign on the shtar, the witnesses who sign on the document that create the validity of the get. We will see, I will say, Shitas Rabbi Eliezer, that no, or actually Rabbi Lazar, that it is the witnesses who witness the giving over of the get who actually attest to the validity. But we'll see that. Says the Mishnah, Kol get sheish al eight kusi pasul. We'll say any get in which there is an 8 kusi signed on it, the get is pasul. So also we've spoken about the kusim already many times. Remember again, converts whose conversion ultimately was always a little bit suspect, only because they were still worshiping idolatry even after their conversion, and therefore it was not immediately clear if they were truly Jewish or not. Therefore, again, if you have a get in which you have an 8 kusi, the get itself is pasul. Rashi says, 8 kusi pasul, the chashidi aedus sheker, because they are chashud, we suspect them of lying. Chutz mi Gittin Hashem v'shichrei avadim. Also, with the exception of Gittin Hashem and shichrei avadim, or even if you have an 8 kusi, the get will still be kosher. Ma'aseh sheviu lefnei Rabbi Gamliel lekfar osnai get isha v'hayu eidav eidei kusim v'hechshir. And how the Gemara Mishnah tells a story that one time they brought a get before Rabbi Gamliel in kfar osnai. It was a get isha, and there were eidei kusim. There were witnesses who were kusim who were signed on it, and Rabbi Gamliel said that the get was kosher. All right, we'll have to explain that story. Says the Gemara, Mani Masnisin, whose opinion does a Mishnah affect? I will say this is fascinating. Lo Tanakama, v'lo Rabbi Elazar, v'lo Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel. So the Mishnah is not the Tanakama, it's not Rabbi Elazar, and it's not Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel. Now, what does that mean? Abba say, listen to this. This is really amazing. This Sanya, matzahs kusi. Abba say, let's say a kusi makes shmura matzah. Right? Let's say a kusi makes shmura matzah. So the shaila is matzahs kusi muteres. So the matzah of a kusi is muter. V'adam yotze ba yidei chavasa b'Pesach. And a person could fulfill his obligation on Pesach. Now I will say, take a look at Rashi for just a moment. This is amazing. Rashi says, matzahs kusi muteres. There's 2 different statements that are being made over here. What does it mean that the matzah of a kusi is muter? So Rashi says, b'Pesach la'achila v'lo chayshinun shema hechmitza. So we'll say when it says that it's mutter, it means that we assume that the matzah of a kusi is not chametz. That's number 1. Next, v'adam yotzei b'yidei chavasa b'Pesach. Look at the next Rashi. A person could fulfill his obligation with it on Pesach. Says Rashi, mishum chavas layla harishon shu chayev le'echol matzah mishtameres kidichsiv ba'erev tochlu matzos va'afilu yadinan ba Delo hichmitza lo nafak ba ela imkin avad la shimor l'shem chovas matzah dichsev ushmartem es hamatzos or mitzvos v'kusim b'kiyemein shetzricha l'shtamer l'shma va'osin la shimor. So also listen to this. This is just a general important halacha to know. You know, people often wonder, so I don't understand, why do I have to spend $22 a pound on shmura matzah, right? So my Yehuda matzos are also kosher Pesach. So why can't I use those? So first of all, you should know it's not so pashat halachically. According to many, you can use those. You shouldn't, but you technically can use them if a person doesn't have anything else. The idea is that shmura matzah has to be shmura, has to be guarded. Machlokes as it's shmura mishas ktsira, shmura mishas techina. But let's assume for a moment it has to be guarded from the time that the wheat is harvested, that it doesn't come in contact with any kind of water. What the Tanakama is saying over here is not only is the matzah of a kusi not chametz, but the matzah of a kusi is kasher for shmura matzah. That we believe that the kusi ultimately, again, properly guarded the wheat from the time that it was harvested. They would not come in any contact with water, and therefore can be used to discharge my biblical obligation of matzah on the Leil HaSeder. On the Leil HaSeder. That's the Tanakama. Rabbi Elazar Oser, Lefi Shein Bekin Betik Duke Mitzvos. Rabbi Elazar says you can't use their matzah. You can't use their matzah. Rabbi Elazar is prohibiting it on all counts. It's chametz, and you can't go ahead and use it for shmura matzah either. Why? Because kusim are not meticulous with the details of mitzvos. Rabbi Shimon Gamliel says, 1 second. Kol mitzvah shech ziku bakusim. Listen to this. Kol mitzvah shech ziku bakusim harbe medaktikin ba yoser mi Yisrael. So I will say, Rabbi Shimon Gamliel says it depends. Kusim, they're like smorgasbord Jews. So what happens? So they like this, they don't like that. They'll take a little bit of this. No, thank you for that. But whatever they do take, whatever they do, they're exceptionally meticulous. So I will say, so here you have a three-way machlokes about the matzah of a kusi. Tanakama is saying, absolutely kosher lePesach, and you can even use it for the Seder. Rabbi Elazar is saying, absolutely chametz, can't use it at all. Rabbi Shimon Gamliel says, it depends. Are kusim meticulous with the mitzvah of matzah? If so, their matzah is kosher. If they're not meticulous, then their matzah is not kosher. To which the Gemara says, money. So whose opinion does our Mishnah? Remember, what did our Mishnah say? Our Mishnah said that any get that has an 8 kusi on it is possible, except for Gittin nashim and shechrei avadim. So whose opinion does our Mishnah reflect? Tanakama afilu shar shtaros nami. So we'll say the Tanakama seems to generally validate kusim. So if it's a Tanakama, the signature of a kusi as an 8 should be good, even on other documents other than Gittin nashim and shechrei avadim. So the Gemara says, Rabbi Elazar afilu get isha namilo. And if it's Rabbi Elazar, then Abosai, again, Rabbi Elazar seems to invalidate kusim altogether, and therefore, again, even if they sign on a get on Gittin Nashim, it should also not be good. V'ira Rabbi Shimon Gamliel, ida achzik afilu shar shtaras nami, v'ida lo achzik afilu get isha nami lo. And Rabbi Shimon Gamliel's approach is what? We have to see, are they meticulous? Are they not meticulous? So if they're meticulous when they sign on shtaras, then their signature should be valid on all shtaros. And if they're not meticulous on this unsigning shtaros, then their signature should not be valid even on Gittin Nashim. To which Rabbi said, whose opinion? V'chi tema Rabbi Shimon Gamliel u'da achzuk baha v'lo achzuk baha. So Rabbi says, maybe you'll say the Mishnah reflects the view of Rabbi Shimon Gamliel, and it must be the following situation: kusim are meticulous with the laws of Gittin, and therefore, again, because they're meticulous with the laws of Gittin, they are believed in the realm of Gittin, and that's why if an 8 kusi signs on a get, we believe that his signature is valid. But in other areas of shtaros, they're not meticulous. To which the Gemara says, if that's the case, ihachi ma'ir yachad afilu treinami. But say if that's the case, that really kusim are meticulous in the realm of Gittin, just not meticulous in the other areas of shtaros, then what? Why does the Mishnah only validate the signature of what? Of 1 8 kusi. Let it be what? Even 2 8-day kusim, right? Again, if they're meticulous, then they're meticulous. Then even if both eidim who are kusim, it should be okay. Alama Amar Rabbi Elazar lo echshiru bo ela 8 echad kusi bilvad. Why is it then that we paskin, or why is it then that according to the Mishnah, we only say that only 1 8 kusi is going to be valid? To which the Gemara says, the Olam Rabbi Elazar. The truth is, what's the case? The case over here really is that the Mishnah is reflecting the view of Rabbi Elazar. Now, I'll say Rabbi Elazar says that in general, kusim are invalid because they're not believed. They don't have a cheskas kashrus. So how could Rabbi Elazar allow an 8 kusi to sign on the get? To listen to this. Ukigon techasim Yisrael lebasof. I will say, what's the case? Look at Rashi before you turn the page. Rashi says, Kigon dechasim Yisrael 8 hasheni. So I will say there are 2 witnesses signing on the get. One is a kusi, one is a Yisrael. The Yisrael, the second aid, signs underneath the 8 kusi. Signs underneath the 8 kusi. So I will say, so what's the pshat? What does that mean? Listen to this. Amud Beis. This is amazing. Di'i lav de kusi chavar hava. Because I will say, were it not that the kusi was a chavar. Chavar in this context means, were it not for the fact that this Yisrael knew that the kusi was a reliable individual, lo machtim le mikame. He would not have allowed him to sign first. The fact that the kusi is signed first, and that, again, the Yisrael signed second, indicates that the kusi must be someone of standing. Take a look at Rashi. Di ilav de kusi chaver hava lo havi ha Yisrael machtim le kusi mikame. Were it not that the kusi was a kosher, the Yisrael would not have allowed him to sign first. So the Gemara says, okay, ihachi afilu shar shtaros nami. So say, okay, first of all, we understand that argument. It sounds like a pretty sound argument. Again, if the Yisrael is signing second, it means that he saw the kusi sign, and therefore, again, he's still willing to sign on the document, which the Maisa, again, must mean that he knows that the kusi is kosher. So if that's the case, why should this halacha be unique to Gittin? Why don't we say that by any shtar, that as long as the Yisrael signed second, which means he allowed the Kusi to sign before him, that by itself attests to the validity of this Kusi as an aid. To which the Gemara says, no, because by other shtaros, Ema, Ela Imrinon, Ravcha Shavak Leman de Kashish Minei. So we'll say, because by other shtaros, I would say that the reason the Yisrael signed second was why? Because there were other people around, and he thought that another Yisrael was going to be appointed ultimately again to sign as a witness as well. That other Yisrael was older than him, and therefore he left space on top for ultimately an older person to sign. Out of deference to the older individual, he'll suggest to you should know, this will get into this, but this is a fascinating discussion in general in terms of signing shtaros. Is someone permitted to be deferential to someone else and sign second, leaving space on the top? It's an interesting din in shtaros, which we'll discuss. In any event, what the Gemara is suggesting over here is that by other shtaros, the fact that the Yisrael signed second is not a raya, because maybe he wasn't leaving room for the kusi. Maybe there was another elderly Jew over there who he thought was going to sign, and therefore is leaving space for the elderly Jew to sign, not the kusi. And when it turns out that the kusi signed, the Yisrael's second signature is not a stempel on the signature on the kusi. If that's the case, I don't understand, says the Gemara, Hachanami, Rav Chashavak Leman de Kashish Minei. So why don't you say something by Gittin then? I don't understand. If that's your argument for saying that the signature of a Yisrael under an Eid Kusi doesn't work ultimately again by Shar Shtaros, because the concern is that maybe the Yisrael signed second because he thought there was another Jew who was signing on top, a Jew who was older than him, and therefore again the signature of the Jew second does not validate the signature of the Kusi above him. Why don't you make that same argument by Gittin Hashem as well? Oh, to which the Gemara says, Amur Papa, Zos Omeres, Eide Haget, Ein Chosmin Ze Below Ze. Oh, Rabbi says Rav Papa, because you see, bless you, because you see a very important yisod, which is what? Which is that Lamaisa, again, when it comes to a get, the witnesses on Gittin cannot sign. The witnesses for a get only sign in the presence of one another. Let's take a look at Rashi for just a moment over here. Zos Omeres, Masnisin de Machshir Beget, Upasal B'Shar Shtaros. So we'll say our Mishnah that allows for an Eid Kusi to sign, and with the Yisrael, and it says that that's kosher, but pasels by other shtaros. Ashmo'inon de Eide Haget in Chosmin Elazeh Bifnei Zeh teaches us that the Eide Haget only sign in the presence of one another. Hilchach al karchach Yisrael zeh ra es hakusi chosim lamala v'chasim lamata. Therefore, I will say, because by Gittin, the witnesses must sign within the presence of one another. Therefore, the Yisrael saw the Kusi sign first, and he still decided to sign second. V'ilav dechavarhu lo chasmi mikamei. And were it not that the Yisrael knew that the Kusi was a chavar, that he was trustworthy, the Yisrael would not have signed under him. Aval she'edei shar shtaros chos min zeh shelo bifnei zeh. Hilchach ikal mechash Yisrael zechasam rishon betachtis hashtar v'shavak ravcha leman dekoshish v'lo l'adashi chas mu'as hakusin l'malam. Isn't this amazing? This is amazing, no? Incredible, thank you. Right? So this is fascinating because this is a fundamental din in shtaros. What the Gemara is saying is like this: when it comes to Gittin, there's no such thing as, okay, I'll take the get to Eid number 1, he'll sign, thank you very much. I'm going to take a location for Eid number 2. The Eidim of the get must sign within the presence of one another. Therefore, again, in that case, where Eid number 1 is a Kusi, Eid number 2 is a Yisrael, Yisrael is only going to sign if what? If he knows that Kusi is a valid upstanding, because I will say, you should know in general, what's driving this is, the Gemara automatically assumes people never want to put their names on invalid shtaros, on invalid documents. Why? Because if it turns out that the document is invalid, it erodes your credibility. Therefore, again, if I'm going to put my signature on something, I'm going to know who that guy is on the top line. So even though that guy is a kusi, the fact that I'm signing under says that I know that he's kosher. But I will say, says the Gemara over here, when it comes to other shtaros, So there is not a din that the witnesses have to sign in the presence of one another. Therefore, again, if I'm with a group of people and the Baal Ashtar asks me to sign, and I see there's an elderly Jew next to me, I assume he's going to ask him next. So what happens? I sign second because I want to leave out of deference to the older individual. I leave the room, and then it turns out that what? That the Baal Ashtar asks the Kusi to sign. I may never even know about that. Why? Why? Because I'm not obligated to be there when the other witness signs. Therefore, suggest the Gemara where you have an Eid Kusi and then second signature Yisrael by a get, and the truth is, you see, based on this, it doesn't even matter if the Yisrael signature is first or second, because by Gittin, at the end of the day, but second is even better. But by Gittin, at the end of the day, witnesses cannot sign not in the presence of. Witnesses must sign in the presence of one another. By Shar Shtaros not. To which the Gemara says, by the way, my timer, why is it that by Gittin, witnesses must sign in the presence of one another? Ravashi, Gezerah Mishum Kulchem. I will say, well, actually see this case. This is an incredible case. The case of Kulchem, where a man says to a group of people, Kulchem kisvu get leishti. All of you, let's say he says to a group of 10 people, I want all of you to write a get for wife. So the Gemara says, what do we do with that statement? So the way the Gemara interprets the statement is that one person writes, everyone else signs as Eidim. So in a case of Kulchem, everyone must sign in the presence of one another. So the Gemara essentially says, in order to avoid any confusion, in all cases of Gittin, we make the witnesses sign in the presence of one another. Gufa, Amr Rebbe Lazar, Lo Hichshiru Bo Ela Eid Echad Kusi Bilvad. So remember again, Rebbe Lazar said that we only, even though we allowed by Gitinashim Shechrei Avadim the use of an Eid Kusi, we only allow the use of one Eid Kusi. That's it, one Eid Kusi per get, not more than one. So the Gemara says, "My Kamash Malon." So what is it coming to teach? As Tanina, we learned this in the Mishnah. Kol get sheish alav Eid Kusi pasel. We'll say, what did the Mishnah say? Any get, any document that has an Eid Kusi on it is pasel. Chutz mi Gittin Hashem v'Shechrei Avadim. So the Mishnah said explicitly that even when it comes to Gittin Hashem v'Shechrei Avadim, all that is permitted is what? Is one Eid Kusi. To which the Gemara says, "Imas nisin havamin afilu treinami," because from the Mishnah I could have said that really the Mishnah is actually saying that even 2 kusim are permitted on a get. But v'hadik tanichad mishum de b'shtaros afilu chad nami lo. The only reason the Mishnah wrote 1 is to teach me that even 1 is problematic ultimately again by other shtaros. Kamashman Abbas, I know that the Mishnah is teaching me that even by Gittin Nashim and Shechrei Avadim, where an 8 kusi is kosher, it's only what? Only 1 8 kusi per get or per shikra avadim, but not 2. So the Gemara says, "Utrelo, is that true? You can't have 2 8 kusim. V'hakatani ma'isa ve'viu lifnei Rabbi Gamliel l'kfaros nai get yishvayolav eidiv eida kusim v'hichshir." I will say, the Mishnah was very strange because after the Mishnah says you could use 1 8 kusi, so what does the Mishnah say? The Mishnah tells a ma'isa, tells a story. They brought a get before Rabbi Gamliel in kfaros nai, and what happened? There were 2 8 kusim on the get. And yet, Rabbi Gamliel said that what? That it was kosher. So as it says the Gemara, Amar Abaye, Tani Eido. So we'll say, so don't read it as Vahayu Eidav Eidei Kusim. Rather read it as Tani Eido. There was an Eid Kusi. 1 Eid Kusi. Rava Amar Rava says, no, that's not what it says. The Olam Trey. It's not true. The story of Rabbi Gamliel was with a get that had 2 Eidei Kusim on it. And what happened? Rabbi Gamliel Miflik Palik. Rabbi Gamliel is arguing on the first part of the Mishnah. Here's how the Mishnah is supposed to use. So we'll say the first part of the Mishnah says that how many kusim are kosher on a get? It's not a joke, right? How many kusim, right? It's 1 kusi maximum per get, right? All you could have is maximum 1 8 kusi. And what happens? The Mishnah then says, "The Rabbi Gamliel machshir b'shnayim." Rabbi Gamliel says, no, you could even have 2 8 kusim on a get, and the Gemara even tells a story to back up that assertion of Rabbi Gamliel. Ma'asanami sheviu lifnei Rabbi Gamliel lekfar osnai get isha v'hayu eidav eidei kusim v'hechsher. And the Mishnah actually tells a story where ultimately again, they brought a get to Rabbi Gamliel in Kfar Osnai, and there were 2 witnesses who were kusim on the get, and Rabbi Gamliel paskin that the get was kosher. So again, obviously we don't have the case of kusim today, But the interesting question in terms of kashrus of edim, meaning what type of people are kosher to sign on a get, Emir Hashem, we're going to do that in a later sugya. But just understand that this sugya opens the door for that. But you see clearly, you show, so the Rambam paskins like the Tanakama, not like Rabbi Gamliel. So the Rambam says that technically speaking, if you have one aid kusi, ultimately on the get will be kosher, which already tells us that there is some level of imperfection of edus allowed on a get. Now, both say all of this is mishum iguna akilu barabanon, right? All of this is in order to go ahead and to relax certain standards in order to prevent aguna situations recurring. In other words, that once a couple has decided to divorce, our job, the halacha's job, is to make the process as easy as possible for the woman to get her get. Of course, again, the major sugya upon which all of this hinges is, do we paskin Ede Mesira or Ede Chasima Karsi? Obviously, if you paskin Ede Mesira Karsi, it's the witnesses who witness the giving over of the get, then the truth is what? Signatures on the get are not really necessary altogether. So again, there's a lot of stuff going on over here right now, so you'll just keep it all in mind. But I will tell you one piece of halacha l'maaseh that does come out from this, is that we paskin that the witnesses who sign on the get must sign within the presence of one another. So we'll say you can't draft the get and take it from witness to witness to witness, but rather the witnesses must be together and must sign in the presence of one another. Mishnah. Kol ashtaros ha'olim barakosha al dekochavim. Well, it's another interesting case. All shtaros that are written in Gentile courts, afapi shechosmeim al dekochavim ksherim. Even though Rabbosai, even though the signatures on it are Gentiles, the shtaros are ksherim. Chutz migitei noshem v'shechrei avadim. Also, with the exception, ultimately, again, of gitei noshem and shechrei avadim. Which, so the Gemara says, Reb Shimon Omer, af elu ksherin. Also, Reb Shimon says that even gitei noshem and shechrei avadim that are done in Gentile courts are kosher. We'll say it's amazing. He says, lo huskru ela bizman shenasu behedjot. The only problem we'll say is if a gitei noshem and shechrei avadim are done by a hedyot. Hedyot, Rashi says, is ayidei odi kochavim hedyotos she'inan danyonim. So Reb Shimon says that if gitei noshem and shechrei avadim are done by Gentile judges in a Gentile court, the document stands. The problem is if you go to your Gentile neighbor and say, listen, do you mind, you have a couple of minutes this Sunday afternoon, would you mind just drafting a get for me? That's going to be where the problem is. But I will say, this is a mind-blowing shita. So Shimon actually says that even gitei noshem shechrei avadim that are drafted in Gentile courts ultimately will be kosher. Says the Gemara, Kapasek Vitani. Let's just at least start this, because this is a really fascinating sugya. Kapasek Vitani. Now, remember, what was the first part of the Mishnah? First part of the Mishnah made it sound like all shtaros, all documents that are executed in a Gentile court are kosher. So the Gemara says, Kapasek Vitani, lo shna mecher, v'lo shna matana. Now, the Mishnah seems to validate all types of shtaros. It doesn't make a difference if it's a shtar mecher or a shtar matana, a document of sale or a gift document. Now it says the Gemara, let's analyze this. Bishlama mecher michi yoyev zuzi kamayhu dekana vishtara raya ba'almahu de'ilo yoyev zuzi kamayhu lo hava mari nafshaya v'kasina le'shtara. So I understand why what we call a shtar mecher. We'll say, what's a shtar mecher? Shtar mecher is a bill of sale. Right, a contract of sale. We'll say now, generally, again, if you're going to buy property, so remember, property is bought with money. So the assumption is that if a Gentile court is going ahead and writing a document of sale, what does that mean? It means they saw the transaction occur. In other words, they saw the money change hands, and they saw, again, the buyer give the seller money. And we'll say, in this case, again, so remember, it's the money that affects the actual transaction. The document itself is only what? Is only proof of transaction. It's what we call a shtar raya. It's just the proof that the sale actually occurred. So I understand why if that document is drafted in a Gentile court, it will be kosher arabosai. Because remember, the Gemara is operating on a very interesting assumption, which is what? That Gentile courts are just. Right, that's that again, and the reason for that is because non-Jews, B'nai Noach, one of the Sheva Mitzvahs B'nai Noach is what? To set up a Batei Din, to set up a judicial system. So we're assuming right now that the Gentile judicial system is just as well. So therefore, again, judges are not going to record a deed of sale unless, of course, what? They saw the transaction executed in front of them. Because also remember again, the Gentile judicial system also has to make sure that its honor and its integrity is intact. So unless, of course, they saw money change hands, they are not going to record any document. Therefore, I understand why the shtar will be kosher. Elamatana b'maika kanilov b'maika kani. Rabbi say, if I'm giving a gift to someone, so how is a gift conveyed? A gift is conveyed. Ownership of a gift is conveyed. How, Rabbi say? Through a shtar. Through a shtar. That's what happens. A shtar matana. I write up a shtar. So elamatana b'maika kanilov lav b'hai shtara v'hai shtara chaspa ba'almahu. But Rabbi say again, when it comes to matana, Rashi says over here, "Da'ai v'ashtar hu kana osim misiyas ashtar hechi makni hashtar chasam." So let's listen to this. So when it comes to a matana, Rabbi said the way a matana is conveyed is like this. Let's say I want to gift you something, but I want to gift you my summer home in Florida. But we're going ahead. But we're in Baltimore. So how do I gift you something that is not here? How do I gift you something? Through a shtar. In which case, Rabbi say again, that shtar is the mechanism of conveyance, right? That shtar. Suppose you hear the difference. There are two different types of shtaros. So it's called a shtar raya. Shtar raya means what? All that shtar does is it attests to a transaction that occurred. So I want to buy your house. I'm going to give you the money. The fact that I gave you the money, that's recorded in the shtar. But the shtar is not the mechanism of conveyance. The shtar just tells me what happened. That's different than a shtar matana. Because what does the shtar matana do? The shtar matana is actually the shtar that allows for the transaction to occur. Says the Gemara, I understand if you want to tell me that a shtar raya drafted by a Gentile court should work. I got it. But how could a shtar matana work? That means, again, it's the Gentile court that is actually allowing for the transaction to occur. Is that really possible? The Gemara literally says, "V'hai shtar chasa ba'amahu." Why should a shtar of conveyance hold any water if it's drafted by a Gentile court? It should be just like a pottery shard. Amar Shmuel, Dina Demachusa Dina. To which Shmuel says it does work. You know why it works, Rabosai? Because we abide by the laws of the land, which means that we abide by the court systems of the land as well. And because of that, therefore, again, even the shtar matana that is drafted by the courts of the land ultimately is a valid shtar, and therefore the transaction will be valid. The other possibility is vi by sema tani chutz mikigiti nashim. Rabbi said the second answer is, you know what, it doesn't work. Chutz mikigiti nashim means chutz mikigiti nashim. Rabbi say that. What does that mean? The Mishnah is only validating any shtar that is only like a shtar raya. But any shtar that is like Gittin Hashim. So what does it mean, Gittin Hashim? Just like a get is a shtar that affects a transaction. In this case, the transaction is divorce. So too, again, any shtar that affects a transaction will not be kosher in our cause, will not be kosher Gentile cause. So both sides, we end off over here. I'm going to leave you on this cliffhanger with a fundamental machlokes. Here's what everybody agrees. Don't really have to stop. Everybody agrees that a shtar raya, a document that just attests to the fact that a transaction occurred, such a shtar is kosher when it comes from a Gentile court. What's the machlokes? What happens if it's not a shtar raya, but it's what we'll call a transactional shtar? It's a shtar that actually, the shtar itself affects the transaction, like a matana, like a get. So what's my second opinion says? Those type of shtaros do not work when they are ultimately, again, affected when they are drafted or when they are written in Gentile courts. They only work in Beis Din. Other opinion will say no, they even work in Gentile courts. Why? Because Dina de Malchusa Dina. And Abba said the Rush has a whole arichos over here, which maybe we'll touch on tomorrow a little bit, about when we say Dina de Malchusa Dina, when we don't say Dina de Malchusa Dina. Meretz Hashem to be continued tomorrow. I'm sorry? I know.